The rain had not stopped in 3 days when the stranger walked up the road to Thornmore Hall. He carried nothing but a canvas bag and a scar across his left hand that he kept covered, even in the wet. The villagers who passed him on the lane did not know his face. 15 years does terrible things to a man who has spent them working stone quarries under another name. And Gabriel Ashworth had made certain, in every way that mattered, that the boy who once lived in that house was dead. He stopped at the iron gate and looked up at the hall through the gray curtain of rain. The windows were dark. Smoke rose from only one chimney. The gardens, once his mother's pride, had gone to bramble and rot. He had imagined this moment for 15 years, and now that it had come, he felt nothing but a cold, patient stillness settling into his chest, like frost creeping under a door. He walked to the servants' entrance and asked for work. The housekeeper, a thin woman named Mrs. Pruitt with suspicious eyes, looked him over twice before she let him in. "We need a groundskeeper," she said. "The last one left without notice. Strange things happening in this house lately. Most don't stay." "I don't frighten easily," Gabriel said, and gave a false name. Thomas Weir, a name with no history, no family, no grave attached to it. She hired him that same hour. That night, lying in the narrow room above the stables where he had once, as a boy, hidden from his stepfather's rages, Gabriel listened to the rain on the roof and thought of the fire. He had been 20 years old. His fiancée, Isabel Hartley, had been staying in the West Wing that winter, waiting for the spring wedding. The fire had started near midnight. By morning, half the house was ash, and Isabel was dead in the wreckage, and Gabriel's own father lay dying of smoke at his bed, and everyone said Gabriel had done it, said he had gone mad with debt and jealousy, said he had wanted the inheritance and Isabel's dowry both, and had set the fire himself. He had run before they could hang him. He had spent 15 years proving, in his own mind at least, that a man could survive anything except the accusation of murder against the people he loved most. He had never proven it to anyone else. Until now, because 3 months ago, in a tavern 200 miles from Thornmore, a dying man had told him the truth. A former stable hand, coughing blood into a rag, had confessed that he'd been paid to set that fire, paid by someone inside the house. Someone with everything to gain and nothing to lose. The stable hand had not lived long enough to say the name, but Gabriel already knew who now owned Thornmore Hall. He had read it in a newspaper years ago in a filthy inn on the coast, and the words had gone through him like a blade. Mr. Edmund Caldwell, of Thornmore Hall, married this spring to Miss Margaret Whitfield. Edmund, his stepbrother, the boy who had grown up in the same house, eaten at the same table, and inherited everything the moment Gabriel disappeared. The first week, Gabriel said nothing and watched everything. He learned that Edmund Caldwell was a man both feared and pitied by the servants, feared for his temper, pitied for a wife who moved through the house like a ghost herself, pale and silent, rarely leaving her rooms except to walk the gardens alone at dusk. He learned that the West Wing had never been rebuilt. It stood behind boarded windows, untouched for 15 years, as though the house itself refused to forget what had happened there. And he learned, on the 3rd night, that Margaret Caldwell did not sleep. He saw her from the stable yard, a candle moving behind the glass long after midnight, pacing the same room over and over, like something caught in a trap of her own making. He told himself it was not his concern. He was here for one purpose only, to find proof, real proof, that would put a rope around the neck of the man who had murdered his father and his fiancée and stolen 15 years of his life. He was not here to wonder about a stranger's grief. But grief, he had learned long ago, has a particular way of walking. And Margaret Caldwell walked like a woman haunted by something she could not confess. He found his opening 2 weeks later, when Edmund summoned the groundskeeper to clear the overgrown path behind the old West Wing, a path no one had walked in years. Gabriel worked slowly, cutting back the bramble, and when he was certain no one watched, he tried the boarded door. It gave, rotted at the hinge. Inside, the wreckage of the old wing remained almost exactly as it had been left. Blackened beams, a collapsed staircase, and beneath years of dust and fallen plaster, half buried in the ruin of what had once been Isabel's sitting room, something caught the gray daylight. A brooch, silver, shaped like a swallow in flight. He had given it to her the winter before the fire. He knelt and pulled it free with hands that shook for the first time in 15 years. It should have burned. Silver does not simply survive a fire that consumed a wing of the house, unless it had been placed there afterward. Unless someone had returned to that room after the flames were out and left it, perhaps by accident, perhaps in the chaos of pulling bodies from the ash. He turned it over, and on the back, scratched crudely into the metal, were two letters that had not been there when he gave it to her. E.C., his stepbrother's initials. He did not know yet what they meant. A claim of ownership, a signature of guilt, a cruel joke carved by a boy who had always resented what Gabriel had, and he did not. But it was something. It was the first solid thread in 15 years of silence, and he closed his fist around it as though it might dissolve if he let go. That night, he almost missed the sound of footsteps behind him in the dark garden. "You shouldn't be back there," Margaret Caldwell said. Her voice was quiet, but there was no fear in it, only a strange, tired resignation. "No one goes into the West Wing. The path needed clearing, ma'am." "That's not what I asked." He said nothing. She studied him in the moonlight for a long moment, and something in her expression shifted, a flicker of recognition that made his pulse stop. "You have his eyes," she said finally. "Whose, ma'am?" "The boy who used to live here. Before the fire. Before my husband inherited everything." She looked away, toward the dark ruin behind them. "I've seen his portrait. In the one room Edmund never lets anyone clean." Gabriel's throat tightened. "I couldn't say, ma'am." "No," she said softly. "I don't suppose you could." She did not accuse him. She did not call for anyone. She simply turned and walked back toward the house, and Gabriel stood alone in the dark, understanding for the first time that his disguise had already begun to fail, and that the woman who had seen through it might be the only person in this house not entirely loyal to his enemy. Over the following days, Margaret found small reasons to speak with him. A question about the roses, a comment about the weather, and slowly, in fragments, she told him things she should not have told the groundskeeper. That her husband drank heavily on the anniversary of the fire, every year, and wept alone in his study. That he kept a locked drawer in his desk that no one, not even she, was permitted to open. That the fire 15 years ago had made Edmund a wealthy man overnight. And that wealth, she said bitterly, had bought her a marriage, but never a husband's trust. "He watches me," she said one evening, "as though he's waiting for me to leave him, as though he knows I would, if I only had somewhere to go." Gabriel listened to all of it, cataloging every detail like evidence laid before a jury only he could see. And somewhere in those quiet conversations in the garden at dusk, he found himself no longer thinking only of revenge, but of the woman trapped inside the house his enemy had built on ashes, a woman who reminded him, in ways he did not want to admit, of the life that had been stolen from him. He told himself it changed nothing. He told himself a great many things in those weeks that were not entirely true. The locked drawer became his obsession. He waited until a night when Edmund rode into the village, drunk on business and brandy both, and Mrs. Pruitt had retired early with a headache. Margaret, when he found her in the hall, did not ask what he intended. She simply pressed a small brass key into his palm. "I copied it months ago," she said. "I always meant to look. I never had the courage. Why give it to me now?" Because I think you already know what's inside it, she said. And because I think you've been waiting 15 years to find out. The drawer held letters, correspondence between Edmund and the stable hand who had since died 200 miles away, coughing his confession into a rag. Payments recorded in Edmund's own hand, disguised as wages for work never done. And beneath the letters, wrapped in oilcloth, a second brooch? No, not a second. Gabriel recognized it instantly. It was Isabel's other piece, the matching pin he had never had the chance to give her, kept as a trophy, a private, sickening keepsake of the night everything had burned. Edmund had not simply arranged the fire out of greed for the estate. He had loved Isabel himself, and could not bear to see her married to his stepbrother. He had destroyed 3 lives to erase a wedding, and called it inheritance ever after. Gabriel stood in that study with 15 years of grief finally given a shape, a name, a motive, and he understood, with terrible clarity, that proof alone would not be enough. Edmund Caldwell was wealthy, respected, protected by a name that Gabriel no longer had. A magistrate would need more than letters from a dead man to hang the master of Thornmore Hall. He would need Edmund's own confession, and he would need it witnessed. The storm came 4 nights later, the worst of the season, rattling the boarded windows of the west wing as though the fire itself wanted to return. Gabriel walked into Edmund's study without knocking. No longer Thomas Weir, no longer a groundskeeper with a false name and a lowered gaze. He set the brooch, the letters, and the oilcloth bundle on the desk between them. Edmund Caldwell looked up, and for a moment, in the candlelight, his face went the color of old bone. "It isn't possible," he whispered. "I've been called worse than a ghost," Gabriel said. "Hello, Edmund." What followed was not the confrontation Gabriel had imagined for 15 years, full of shouted accusations and righteous fury. It was quieter and somehow far more terrible. Edmund's composure cracking piece by piece, denial giving way to justification, justification giving way, finally, to the truth spilling out of him like something long infected, finally lanced. He had loved Isabel since they were children. He could not watch her marry Gabriel. He had told himself, that night, that he only meant to frighten them, to delay the wedding. And then the fire had grown faster than he intended, and by the time he understood what he'd done, it was already too late to stop it, too late to save the father who had raised them both, too late to do anything but let an innocent man take the blame and disappear. "I have hated myself every day since," Edmund said, and there were tears now, ugly and real. "You cannot hate me more than I hate myself." "I don't need to hate you," Gabriel said quietly. "I only needed you to say it." It was then that Margaret stepped from the shadow of the doorway, where she had been standing, unseen, through every word. Edmund's face went white in a different way. "Margaret, I heard all of it," she said. Her voice did not shake. Every word. The magistrate came the following morning, summoned not by Gabriel, but by Margaret herself, who carried the letters and the brooch to the village with a composure that surprised even her husband. Edmund Caldwell did not hang. In the end, the law is rarely as clean as the heart demands, but he lost the house, the name, and the freedom that 15 years of silence had bought him, sentenced instead to the kind of slow, public ruin that Gabriel found, to his own surprise, was justice enough. Thornmore Hall passed by the strange mathematics of old inheritance law, and a will no one had thought to contest in 15 years, back to the only surviving heir who could prove his blood, a groundskeeper named Thomas Weir, who was not, after all, a stranger to the estate. Gabriel stood at the edge of the burned west wing on the morning after the trial, the same silver brooch in his hand, and understood at last that he had not come back merely for revenge. He had come back to lay Isabel to rest, properly, finally, in the small stone chapel behind the house, where he buried the brooch beside her grave and stood in the cold morning wind until the ache in his chest became, for the first time in 15 years, something closer to peace than grief. Margaret found him there an hour later. Her own future is uncertain and unwritten as his, and neither of them spoke of what might come next. They simply stood together at the edge of the ruin, watching the sun break over the moors for the first time in weeks. Two people who had both survived a house built on someone else's lie, and who understood, without needing to say it aloud, that the ashes behind them no longer had the power to define what came after.